All 5 of us belong to you now." The words hung in the crisp morning air like frost on a winter fence post. The 5 small faces peering through the wrought iron gate seemed to carry the weight of countless untold stories behind their hopeful eyes. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The wind howled like a wounded beast across the Wyoming plains as Jedediah Boone trudged the final steps toward his ranch house. February of 1881 had brought the cruelest winter in memory, with snow piled higher than fence posts and temperatures that froze a man's breath before it left his lips. His muscles ached from hours of breaking ice in the cattle troughs, his fingers numb despite thick leather gloves. He almost missed the sound. Faint voices carried on the bitter wind. Jed paused, his hand on the gate latch, listening. There it was again, unmistakably human. He squinted into the darkness beyond the fence line. 5 small figures materialized from the swirling snow, huddled together like a single creature with too many limbs. Children. Out here, miles from town, in the dead of night. "Lord Almighty," Jedediah whispered, pushing through the gate. The tallest child, a girl of perhaps 12, stepped forward protectively, her arm around a smaller child whose face was buried against her side. "All 5 of us belong to you now," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the violent shivering that racked her thin frame. Jed stared, words frozen in his throat. The girl, Hannah, he would later learn, met his gaze with eyes too old for her young face. Behind her 4 smaller children trembled in the merciless cold. "There's been a mistake," he finally managed. "I don't—" His words died as the smallest girl stepped into the lantern light. Mary's lips had turned an alarming shade of blue. Her tiny fingers clutched around a tattered rag doll. Beside her, little Rebecca stood barefoot in the snow, her toes surely minutes from frostbite. Something cracked inside Jedediah's chest. A wall he'd built 3 years ago when he buried his wife and infant son. The memory of that loss had kept him isolated, wrapped in solitude like a protective cloak. Now these 5 orphans stood before him, challenging his carefully constructed loneliness. "Come on, then," he said gruffly, his decision made before he fully realized it. Jed awkwardly gathered Rebecca in one arm and Mary in the other, their bodies feather-light against his broad chest. Hannah ushered the 2 boys forward, Samuel, curious despite his exhaustion, and Ephraim, whose wary eyes never left the rancher's face. The weight of the children felt strange in his arms, unfamiliar, yet somehow right. Their small bodies radiated trust he hadn't earned, and responsibility he wasn't sure he could bear. The wooden steps of the porch creaked under their combined weight as Jedediah shouldered open the door to his modest ranch house. Behind them, the gate swung shut with a finality that would echo through the seasons to come. By sunrise, news of Jedediah Boone's unexpected guests traveled faster than the winter wind across the small Wyoming town. The general store buzzed with whispers as ranchers and townspeople alike exchanged theories about the 5 orphans who had appeared at the solitary man's gate. "Poor Jed," Martha from the bakery clucked her tongue while arranging fresh bread. "A bachelor rancher suddenly saddled with 5 hungry mouths. What does he know about raising children?" Nearby, 3 weathered cowboys chuckled over their morning coffee. "Can you imagine?" one said, slapping his knee. "Boone can barely manage a conversation, let alone 5 little ones underfoot." Their laughter echoed through the store, drawing nods from some and disapproving glances from others. By midday, Jed stood awkwardly in his kitchen, watching Hannah attempt to organize her siblings. Mary clutched her rag doll while Rebecca followed her around like a shadow. Samuel explored every corner of the modest ranch house, and Ephraim sat sullenly by the window, his eyes tracking the movement of horses in the corral. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Jed tense. Sheriff Wallace dismounted at the gate, his tall frame casting a long shadow as he approached the porch. The lawman removed his hat, revealing salt and pepper hair as he entered. "Word travels fast," Jed muttered, offering the sheriff a seat at his worn wooden table. Wallace's weathered face held a mixture of concern and official duty. "5 orphans, Boone. That's quite a situation you've gotten yourself into." His eyes scanned the children, who had gathered protectively near Hannah. "They were half frozen at my gate," Jed explained, his voice low. "What was I supposed to do?" The sheriff sighed, leaning forward. "Your intentions are good, but there are regulations. Children without proper documentation, without legal guardianship." He tapped his fingers on the table. It could cause trouble down the line. The orphan train comes through next month. Jed felt a knot form in his stomach as he noticed Hannah's face pale at the mention of the orphan train. The girl's hand tightened around Rebecca's smaller one. "They're staying together," Jed found himself saying, surprising even himself with the firmness in his voice. After Wallace departed, promising to return with proper paperwork, Jed stood at his window, watching the sheriff's figure grow smaller against the vast Wyoming plains. Doubt crept into his mind, like the cold through the cabin walls. What did he know about raising children? His own family was long gone. The town clearly thought him incapable. Perhaps they were right. Ephraim's voice broke through his thoughts. "Are they going to take us away?" the boy asked, his usual defiance replaced by quiet fear. Jed turned, meeting 5 pairs of anxious eyes, and realized he had no answer to give them. Clara Boone arrived at the ranch on horseback 3 days after the children had settled in, her face pinched with disapproval. She dismounted with practiced efficiency, tying her horse to the post before marching toward the house where Jedediah stood on the porch. "I heard the news in town," she announced, removing her gloves with sharp tugs. "5 children, Jed? Have you lost your senses entirely?" Her brother invited her inside where the orphans huddled near the stove. The siblings fell silent as the woman entered, their eyes wary and watchful. Clara's gaze swept over them, assessing each child with the same critical eye she used when evaluating livestock. "The orphan train passes through next Tuesday," she said, accepting the cup of coffee Jed offered. "I've already spoken with Mr. Patterson at the station. He can arrange passage east, where proper families with means can take them in." Hannah stepped forward, her thin shoulders squared beneath her borrowed shirt. "We won't be separated," she declared, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Our mother made us promise to stay together." Clara's eyebrows rose. "Child, be reasonable. Few families can take in 5 children at once. Each of you might find a good home if—" "Then we'll run," Hannah interrupted, moving to stand protectively in front of her siblings. "We've done it before. If anyone tries to put us on that train, we'll disappear into the hills." Ephraim moved to his sister's side, his jaw set in determination. Even little Samuel puffed up his chest, while Mary clutched her rag doll tighter and Rebecca pressed against Hannah's leg. "You see what you've done?" Clara turned to her brother. "Given them false hope? This isn't charity work, Jed. This is 5 mouths to feed on a ranch that barely supports one." Jedediah watched the children, something shifting in his expression. Hannah's fierce protection of her siblings stirred memories of his own childhood, of holding Clara's hand as they stood before their parents' graves, promising they would remain together despite the relatives who wanted to separate them. "They stay," he said finally, his voice rough but certain. "You can't possibly—" "They stay, Clara," he repeated firmly. "At least until spring." Hannah's eyes met his across the room, gratitude and determination mingling in her gaze. The eldest orphan nodded once, a silent pact forming between them. Clara sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her brother's jaw. "On your head be it, then," she muttered, but her eyes lingered on the children with something softer than her initial judgment. "I suppose I'll need to bring by some proper clothes for these little waifs." Jedediah Boone squinted against the harsh morning sun as he loaded wooden posts onto the wagon. The Wyoming wind whipped across the plains, carrying the bite of winter's remnants despite spring's approach. He glanced at Ephraim, who stood by the barn door, arms crossed and lower lip jutting out in defiance. "Need your help today, boy?" Jed called, his voice firm but not unkind. "Cattle'll be through that broken section by sundown if we don't mend it." "I ain't no fence mender," Ephraim muttered, kicking at the dirt with his worn boot. The rancher paused, studying the 10-year-old's stubborn stance. 3 weeks had passed since the children arrived, yet the boy remained the most resistant to Jed's authority. "Every rancher knows fencing," he said simply. "Can't have one without the other." Reluctantly, Ephraim climbed onto the wagon, maintaining a deliberate distance from Jed as they rode out to the property's edge. The vast expanse of Wyoming stretched before them, broken fence posts visible against the golden-brown landscape. For the first hour, they worked in silence. Jed demonstrated how to dig post holes, his weathered hands working with practiced efficiency. Ephraim mimicked his movements, face furrowed in concentration despite his attempts to appear disinterested. "My pa used to say fences tell you what kind of man owns the land," Jed offered, driving a post into the ground with 3 powerful strikes. Ephraim glanced up. "What's that mean?" "Straight fence means a straight man." Jed checked the post's alignment with one eye closed. Crooked fence means trouble brewing. A ghost of a smile crossed the boy's face before he masked it with indifference. By midday, they'd made surprising progress. Jed pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle from his saddlebag and settled against a fence post. He divided the simple meal, cornbread, jerky, and 2 apples, passing half to Ephraim. The boy ate hungrily, his guard lowering with each bite. "You been ranching long?" he asked finally, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Since I was younger than you," Jed replied. "My father taught me, same as I'm teaching you." "You ain't my father," Ephraim said quickly, but the words lacked their usual venom. Jed nodded. "No, I ain't. But you're here now, and so am I." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the whistle of wind through prairie grass. "Hannah says we might not stay," Ephraim ventured, his voice suddenly small. "Says folks in town don't think you should keep us." The rancher studied the boy's face, seeing past the defiance to the fear beneath. "What do you think about that?" Ephraim shrugged, but his fingers tightened around the apple core. "Don't matter what I think." "Matters to me," Jed said quietly. Their eyes met briefly before Ephraim looked away. "I could learn more," he admitted, "about fences and such." Jed's weathered face softened. "I'll teach you everything I know," he promised. "Every bit of it." As they returned to work, the posts stood straighter, and the distance between them had narrowed, just slightly, but enough to matter. The morning dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight glinting off the snow-covered Wyoming plains. Samuel, the curious 6-year-old, had wandered out to explore while Jedediah Boone was busy, mending a broken stove in the ranch house. The boy's fascination with the large metal latches led him to fiddle with the main corral gate, his small fingers working at the mechanism until it gave way with a satisfying click. The sound of thundering hooves drew Jed from the house. His heart nearly stopped at the sight of his entire herd, 23 cattle that represented his livelihood, stampeding across the snowy field toward the open range. "Samuel!" he bellowed, his voice carrying on the winter air. The child stood frozen by the gate, eyes wide with terror at what he'd done. Jed didn't waste time on anger. "Hannah!" he called to the eldest, who was already racing toward him. "Get everyone! We need to round them up before they scatter." Within minutes, the unlikely family was mobilized. Hannah took charge of her siblings with surprising authority, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Ephraim, take the south side with me. Mary, stay with the calves by the fence line." Mary clutched her treasured rag doll to her chest with one hand while using the other to wave her scarf at the confused calves, guiding them back toward the corral. Her blue lips trembled, but determination shone in her eyes. Rebecca, too small to help directly, rode in Jed's arms as he mounted his horse and galloped after the main group. The little girl's squeals of fright soon turned to laughter as they raced across the fields, her tiny hands gripping his coat. "Head them off at the creek," Jed shouted to Ephraim, who had found his courage and was running alongside the slower animals, waving his arms wildly. The boy nodded, his earlier quarrelsome nature forgotten in the excitement of the chase. He moved with surprising skill, anticipating the cattle's movements as if he'd been working livestock his entire young life. For hours, they worked together, shouting, running, falling, and getting up again. Samuel, desperate to make amends, fetched water and helped guide stragglers back toward home. By dusk, exhausted but triumphant, they had recovered every animal. The family gathered in the yard, cheeks flushed with cold and exertion. Jed looked at the 5 children, dirty, tired, but beaming with accomplishment. "We did it," Hannah said softly, snow melting in her hair. The rancher nodded, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. "Yes," he agreed, "we did." Something had shifted between them all. No longer strangers thrust together by circumstance, but a team that had faced calamity and prevailed. That night, as they huddled around the repaired stove, the sense of shared victory lingered. Samuel fell asleep against Jed's shoulder, forgiven without words. The cattle disaster had become something unexpected, the first true test of their unlikely family. The crunch of wagon wheels on frozen ground announced Miss Abigail Turner's arrival at the Boone Ranch. She stepped down carefully, balancing a cloth-covered basket that released wisps of steam into the frigid Wyoming air. The school teacher's visits had become more frequent since the children's arrival, and today she came bearing fresh bread, its yeasty aroma filling the modest ranch house as she entered. "I thought you might appreciate something that wasn't cooked by a man's hand," Abigail said with a gentle smile as Jedediah Boone awkwardly cleared space at his cluttered table. The rancher nodded gratefully, his weathered face softening in a way that only happened around her or the children. "Miss Turner!" Mary exclaimed, rushing forward to hug the teacher's skirts. The young girl had grown less timid in recent weeks, though she still clutched her precious rag doll. Behind her, Samuel peered curiously at the basket while Rebecca shyly hid behind her older brother. "I've brought something else, too," the schoolteacher announced, producing a slate and chalk from her satchel. "Every child should know their letters, even on a ranch." Her eyes met Jed's, seeking approval. "With your permission, of course." Hannah, ever watchful of her siblings' interests, stepped forward. "We'd be grateful, ma'am. Our mother taught us some, but—" She faltered, memories momentarily clouding her young face. "Then we'll continue what she began," Abigail said softly, squeezing the girl's hand. As winter deepened, the teacher's visits became a cherished routine. 3 afternoons each week she arrived after school hours, transforming Jed's dining table into a classroom. Ephraim initially resisted, but even he eventually succumbed to Miss Turner's patient instruction. The townspeople noticed. Sheriff Wallace mentioned it casually during his rounds. Clara raised an eyebrow during her last visit, and Mrs. Peterson at the general store didn't bother hiding her speculation when Jed came in for supplies. "That schoolteacher spends more time at your place than her own lodgings," the shopkeeper remarked. "Quite devoted to those children, isn't she?" Jed merely grunted in response, but later that evening, as Abigail lingered by the hearth after the children had been tucked in, he found himself watching her in the firelight. She sat in what had become her chair, mending Samuel's torn shirt with practiced hands. "You don't have to do all this," he said quietly. Abigail looked up, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I know," she replied simply. The comfortable silence that followed spoke volumes. Her presence had brought more than education to his home. She had brought warmth to rooms that had known only solitude for too long. As she eventually gathered her things to leave, Jed found himself wishing for reasons to make her stay, just a little longer. The crunch of wagon wheels on frozen ground announced Silas Crow's arrival before the man himself appeared. Jedediah Boone straightened from his work on the barn door, watching as the wealthy rancher's polished carriage rolled to a stop in the yard. The contrast between Silas's fine wool coat and Jed's patched jacket couldn't have been more stark. "Boone!" Silas called out, not bothering to dismount. "Heard you've taken on quite the burden." His eyes swept across the modest ranch, lingering on the children who had paused their chores to stare at the visitor. Jed wiped his hands on his trousers. "They're no burden, Crow." Silas chuckled, the sound lacking warmth. 5 mouths to feed on a ranch that barely supported one? I'd call that a burden. He gestured toward his own sprawling property visible on the distant horizon. "I've got 3 times the cattle, hired hands and a proper cook. Those children would want for nothing." Hannah emerged from the house, her stance protective as she positioned herself between the visitor and her younger siblings. Mary clutched her rag doll tightly while Ephraim's hand curled into a fist. "I'm making you an offer, Boone," Silas continued. "Let me take these orphans off your hands. My wife's been wanting company, and we can provide proper schooling, clothes, everything you can't." "We're not for sale," Hannah declared, her voice steady despite her youth. "And we stay together." Silas's expression hardened. "Girl, adults are talking. This isn't about what you want. It's about what's best." "Hannah speaks for all of them," Jed said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "And I agree with her assessment." The wealthy rancher's face flushed. "You're being foolish, Boone. Sheriff Wallace mentioned those children need proper guardianship, papers, legal standing." He leaned forward in his seat. "I have influence with the county judge. I could make things difficult." Samuel and Rebecca had crept closer, huddling behind their eldest sister. Ephraim stepped forward, his young face set in determination. "We belong here," the boy stated firmly. Silas's mouth tightened into a thin line. He flicked the reins, turning his wagon. "Think on it, Boone. My offer won't stand forever, and winter's coming. Hard to feed 5 extra mouths when your cattle are starving." As the carriage rolled away, Jed placed a hand on Hannah's shoulder. The girl looked up, her eyes filled with unspoken fear. "He'll be back," she whispered. Jed nodded, watching Silas's retreating figure. "Yes, but we'll be ready." What neither said aloud was the truth they both understood. Silas Crow didn't want the children out of kindness. He wanted leverage, against Jed, against the land, against the future itself. The night wind rattled the windows of Jedediah Boone's ranch house as the children huddled near the crackling fire. Mary sat apart from the others, her small fingers clutching her tattered rag doll with unusual intensity. The little girl had barely let go of the doll since arriving at the ranch, treating the worn fabric companion as her most precious possession. "Time for bed," Hannah announced, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had become familiar to Jed over the past weeks. As she reached for her younger sister, Mary pulled away, tears welling in her eyes. "She won't let go of that thing even to wash her face," Ephraim muttered, rolling his eyes, though his tone lacked real annoyance. Hannah knelt beside Mary. "The doll needs sleep too," she whispered. As she gently tugged at the toy, a tearing sound filled the quiet room. Mary's wail pierced the night as a seam split along the doll's middle. "I broke her," the child sobbed. Jed crossed the room in 3 strides, his weathered hands awkwardly patting Mary's shoulder. "We can fix it," he promised, though his sewing skills were rudimentary at best. Hannah, already examining the tear, suddenly froze. "There's something inside," she said, her fingers carefully extracting a folded piece of paper from the doll's stuffing. Samuel and Rebecca crowded closer as their older sister unfolded what appeared to be a letter. Ephraim stood back, trying to appear disinterested, though his eyes never left the paper. "It's from Mother," Hannah breathed, her voice catching. She began to read aloud, her words slow and deliberate. "My beloved children, if you are reading this, I am gone. Stay together, for you are strongest as one. Seek a man of honor who will keep you as family. Trust your hearts to know him." The room fell silent save for the popping of the fire. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward Jed, who stood motionless, the weight of those words settling on his shoulders. "That's why we came to you," Hannah finally said. "Mother always spoke of a rancher with kind eyes who once helped her. She said if anything happened, we should find you." Jed took the letter with trembling hands, reading the faded script again, the plea of a dying mother entrusting her children to a man she'd barely known, a man she believed would have honor enough to keep them together. "She chose right," Samuel declared with childish certainty. That night, long after the children had fallen asleep, Jedediah sat by the dying embers, the letter spread before him. The responsibility it bestowed both terrified and humbled him. In the flickering light, he made a silent promise to a woman he couldn't remember meeting. He would become the man of honor she believed him to be. The first signs of spring arrived with a vengeance across the Wyoming plains. What began as a gentle thaw quickly turned into rushing torrents as snowmelt from the mountains surged through the valley. Jedediah Boone stood at the edge of his property, watching helplessly as the floodwaters tore through the eastern pasture, carrying away nearly 50 yards of fencing in their muddy wake. "Lord have mercy," he muttered, calculating the cost in his head. Posts, wire, and weeks of labor, all washed away in a single night. Back at the ranch house, Hannah noticed his troubled expression as he explained the situation over breakfast. "We'll help you rebuild," she declared, her voice leaving no room for argument. Jed shook his head. "This isn't children's work. We aren't just children anymore," Ephraim countered, surprising everyone with his determination. "We're part of this ranch now." The following morning, all 5 orphans stood ready at dawn, dressed in their work clothes. Even little Rebecca had insisted on coming, her tiny boots sinking into the mud as they trudged toward the damaged section. "Mary and Samuel, you'll gather the smaller pieces of wire," Jed instructed. "Hannah, help me sort what posts can be salvaged. Ephraim, you're strong enough to help dig. Rebecca," he paused, looking at the smallest child, "you're our water carrier." The work was brutal. Spring sun beat down on them as they labored through the day. Jed showed Ephraim how to use the post-hole digger, the boy's face reddening with effort but never complaining. Hannah proved surprisingly adept at straightening bent wire with a pair of pliers, her fingers soon raw despite the cloth wrappings Jed had provided. By midday, Mary's hands were blistered from collecting scattered wire, while Samuel's arms were scratched from dragging posts through brush. Even Rebecca contributed beyond her duties, spotting a section of fencing caught in a tree downstream that they might have missed. As the sun began to set, Jed surveyed their progress. Barely a quarter of the fence repaired, but a solid start. He watched the children, filthy and exhausted but oddly satisfied, sharing water from Rebecca's bucket. "You've done enough today," he said softly. "We'll continue tomorrow." "We're not finished," Hannah replied, wiping sweat from her brow. Something shifted in Jed's chest as he looked at these 5 determined faces. For years, he'd carried his burdens alone, convinced solitude was his lot. Now these children, orphans who'd arrived with nothing, were pouring their strength into his land as if it were their own. "No," he agreed, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. "We're not finished. But we'll finish it together." That night, as they soaked their aching hands in cool water by the stove, Jed realized he was no longer working alone. In these children he'd found not just responsibility, but partnership. The morning began with a bitter argument. Ephraim Boone, though he wasn't truly a Boone yet, had knocked over a pail of fresh milk, and Jed's sharp words cut deeper than intended. The boy stormed out, slamming the door behind him. No one thought much of it at first. Ephraim's temper flared like prairie lightning, quick to strike, but usually quick to pass. By midday, Hannah's worried eyes met Jed's across the table. "He's never stayed away this long," she whispered, clutching Rebecca's small hand. The rancher felt a cold knot form in his stomach. A quick search of the barn and corrals confirmed what they feared. Ephraim was gone. Mary found the note tucked beneath a rock by the gate. In childish scrawl, it declared, "Going to make my own way. Don't need nobody." Jed's weathered face hardened as he read the words, memories of his own youthful pride stirring. Painfully. "The railroad camp," Samuel blurted out. "He said the men there earn real wages." The boy's eyes were wide with worry for his brother. Dark clouds gathered as Jedediah saddled his horse. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, turning the Wyoming soil to treacherous mud. Miss Abigail arrived just as he prepared to leave, her face etched with concern. "I'll watch over the others," she promised, rain dripping from her bonnet. "Bring him home, Jed." The downpour became torrential as he rode. Visibility shrank to mere yards, and the rancher's calls were swallowed by the storm's fury. Hours passed, his clothes soaked through before he spotted a huddled figure beneath a rocky overhang near the tracks. Ephraim sat shivering, pride and misery warring on his young face. The boy's defiant glare crumbled when Jed dismounted and crouched beside him without a word of reproach. "Thought I could get hired on," the 10-year-old mumbled. "Foreman laughed at me." Jed nodded, removing his sodden coat and wrapping it around the child's shoulders. "Takes courage to try," he said simply. "Ain't you mad?" Ephraim's voice cracked. "Terrified is what I was," the rancher admitted, surprising himself with the truth in his words. "Ranch needs you. We all do." Something shifted between them as they shared the shelter, waiting for the worst of the storm to pass. When Jed finally helped Ephraim onto the horse and climbed up behind him, the boy didn't pull away. They rode home side by side on the borrowed mount of a sympathetic railroad worker, Ephraim eventually leaning back against Jed's chest for warmth. Neither spoke much, but the silence held understanding rather than anger. When they crested the final hill, the ranch house windows glowed with lamplight. Hannah stood silhouetted in the doorway. The other children clustered behind her. "Next time you feel like running," Jed said quietly, "come mend fences with me instead." Ephraim nodded, and for the first time, he didn't flinch when the rancher's hand rested on his shoulder. Sheriff Wallace's wagon rattled up the dirt path to Jedediah Boone's ranch one crisp morning, dust trailing behind his approach. The lawman's weathered face betrayed nothing as he dismounted, adjusting his badge before rapping firmly on the doorframe. "Jed," the sheriff nodded curtly when the rancher appeared. "We need to talk about these children." The two men settled at the rough-hewn table while Hannah herded her siblings outside, her wary glance lingering on the sheriff's stern expression. Through the window, Jed could see Ephraim helping Samuel climb the fence, Mary clutching her precious rag doll, and little Rebecca trailing behind. "The Territorial Administration has regulations," Wallace explained, laying out official papers. "Children without proper guardianship must be documented, and their welfare assured. You've got no legal claim to them, and your ranch barely supports you alone." Jed's calloused hands tightened around his coffee mug. "They've nowhere else to go." "The orphan train heads east next month," the lawman continued, unmoved. "Families back east with proper means are looking to adopt. Unless you can prove stable income and suitable living conditions by then, I'll have no choice but to enforce regulations." "They belong together," Jed argued, his voice low but firm. "You'd split them up among strangers?" Wallace sighed, showing a rare glimpse of the man beneath the badge. "It's not about what I want, Boone. It's the law. You need proper documentation, steady income, and community support. The council's watching this situation closely." After the sheriff departed, Jed stood at the gate, watching his cattle graze on the distant hillside. The enormity of what he faced settled on his shoulders like a physical weight. How could he fight territorial regulations? His ranch was struggling, and winter had depleted his reserves. That evening he rode into town, tethering his horse outside the schoolhouse, where lamplights still glowed. Miss Abigail Turner looked up from her papers, her face softening at the sight of his troubled expression. "Sheriff Wallace came today," Jed explained, removing his hat. "Says they'll take the children if I can't prove I can provide for them." The schoolteacher set down her pen. "And can you?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Ranch barely breaks even most years." Abigail stood, her determination visible in every movement. "Then we'll make sure it does better. The children need stability, yes, but they need love more. You've given them that." "What if it's not enough?" he asked, voicing his deepest fear. "Then we fight," she said simply, her hand briefly touching his arm. "This town needs to understand what family truly means. Those children belong with you now, Jed. Anyone with eyes can see it." As he rode home under the vast Wyoming sky, the schoolteacher's words echoed in his mind. For the first time since the orphans had appeared at his gate, Jedediah Boone knew with certainty that he would do whatever it took to keep them. The town hall buzzed with whispers as Miss Abigail Turner rose to her feet, her normally gentle demeanor replaced by steely determination. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the schoolteacher approached the podium, her knuckles white against the worn wood. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room, "I stand before you, not just as an educator, but as someone who has witnessed firsthand the transformation occurring at the Boone Ranch." Jedediah sat rigid in the back row, his weathered hat clutched in his hands. He hadn't expected Abigail to speak on his behalf, especially knowing how the council valued her position in the community. "These 5 children have found more than shelter with Mr. Boone," she continued. "They've found purpose, dignity, and the stability they desperately need. Sending them east on an orphan train would destroy the family they've become." Councilman Peters leaned forward, his spectacles catching the lamplight. "Miss Turner, your concern is admirable, but regulations exist for good reason. A bachelor rancher with limited means hardly constitutes an ideal guardian." "And yet," Abigail countered, "I've watched Hannah teach her younger siblings to read by lantern light. I've seen Ephraim take pride in honest work. I've observed Mary smile again after months of silence." Her voice trembled slightly. "Tell me, gentlemen, what regulation values paperwork over such progress?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. From his seat, Jed noticed Sheriff Wallace's thoughtful expression. "Miss Turner," the mayor interjected, "your position as schoolteacher requires certain discretion. Your advocacy here could be seen as overstepping." The schoolteacher straightened her shoulders. "If speaking for children who cannot speak for themselves costs me my position, then I accept that consequence." Her words hung in the air, heavy with sacrifice. Then, from the middle of the room, Clara Boone stood up. "My brother was always stubborn," she announced, drawing surprised glances. "But he's given those children something I never thought possible, a home where they belong together." One by one, others rose, the blacksmith, the general store owner, even the pastor's wife. Each offered small testimonies of the changes they'd witnessed in both Jed and the orphans. Not everyone was convinced. Silas Crow and his supporters exchanged dark glances, and several council members maintained their stern expressions. But as the meeting adjourned, the tide had visibly shifted. Outside in the crisp evening air, Jed approached Abigail. "You risked everything back there," he said quietly. The schoolteacher smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Some things are worth risking everything for, Mr. Boone." As they walked toward the waiting wagon where the children huddled anxiously, Jed realized the battle wasn't over, but for the first time, they weren't fighting it alone. Samuel's small boots pounded against the dirt path as he raced home, his heart hammering in his chest. He had only meant to explore the town while Hannah helped Miss Abigail Turner with schoolwork, but curiosity had led him past Silas Crow's office window. What he overheard there sent ice through his veins. "The paperwork is nearly complete," Silas had said to 2 stern-looking men in dark suits. "Those children have no legal guardian. Once the state agents confirm Boone's inability to provide proper care, all 5 will be on the next train east. Separate homes, separate states if necessary." Samuel burst through the ranch house door, gasping for breath. "They're going to take us away!" he cried, tears streaming down his dirt-smudged face. "Mr. Crow is talking to men about sending us on trains." Hannah dropped the potato she was peeling and rushed to her brother's side. "Slow down, Sam. Tell us exactly what you heard." Jedediah Boone stepped in from the back porch, his weathered face tightening as Samuel recounted every detail. The rancher's calloused hands clenched into fists, then relaxed with deliberate effort. "State agents," Jed muttered. "Crow's been planning this since you arrived." "Can he do that?" Ephraim asked, his voice cracking. The normally defiant 10-year-old looked suddenly small, perched on the edge of the wooden chair. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Hannah declared, though fear flickered in her eyes. Rebecca clung to Mary's skirts, her small fingers white-knuckled around her sister's fabric. Mary clutched her rag doll, the one containing their mother's letter, tighter to her chest. Jed paced the worn floorboards, his mind racing. Crow has influence with the territorial officials. Money talks in Wyoming, just as it does everywhere else. "But we belong here now," Mary whispered, echoing their mother's words. The rancher knelt before the children, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "Listen to me. Crow may have money and connections, but we have something stronger." "What's that?" Samuel asked, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Truth," Jed replied. "And if we can get enough townsfolk to stand with us, the truth will matter more than Crow's schemes." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the plains, the unlikely family gathered around the table. They drafted letters to Sheriff Wallace, Miss Abigail, and even Clara, explaining their situation and requesting support. "Tomorrow," Jed said as he sealed the final envelope, "we'll need to speak with everyone who might stand with us. Reverend Miller, Doc Peterson, even old Mrs. Whitaker." Hannah nodded, her shoulders squared with determination. "We won't be separated. Not now. Not ever." As darkness fell over the ranch, the six of them moved closer together, a family forged not by blood, but by choice and circumstance, preparing to fight for their right to remain whole. Clara's arrival at the ranch was preceded by a cold front, much like the frosty demeanor she brought with her. Jedediah Boone watched his sister dismount from her wagon, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval as her gaze swept over the children playing in the yard. "Still playing house with these orphans, I see," she remarked, following him into the modest ranch house. The siblings sat across from each other at the worn kitchen table, steam rising from cups of coffee between them. "They have names, Clara," Jed replied quietly, "and they're doing well here." His sister scoffed. "You can barely keep this ranch afloat for yourself. How do you expect to provide for 5 growing children?" The conversation grew increasingly tense until Hannah entered with Rebecca clinging to her skirts. The eldest orphan nodded politely to Clara before ushering her little sister back outside, but not before Jed caught the protective glance she cast his way. "Why are you so determined to see them sent east?" he finally asked, studying his sister's face. "This goes beyond practical concerns." Clara's hands tightened around her cup. "Because I know what happens when people like us try to raise children that aren't ours." "People like us?" Something in her expression cracked. 3 years ago, I petitioned to adopt a child from the orphanage in Cheyenne," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "A little girl. They denied me, said a widow without means or prospects wasn't suitable." Jed stared at his sister, seeing her bitterness in a new light. "You never told me. What was there to tell? That I wasn't good enough?" Her eyes glistened. "I don't want you to face that rejection, Jedediah. These authorities, they don't see the heart, only the circumstances." Understanding dawned on him. Her opposition wasn't cruelty. It was protection born of her own wounded hopes. Later that afternoon, Clara watched from the porch as Ephraim proudly showed Jed a repaired bridle. Mary sat nearby, carefully stitching her doll while Samuel chased chickens around the yard. "They've changed you," she observed when her brother joined her. "I've never seen you so present." Jed nodded. "They need me. And maybe I needed them too." Something softened in Clara's expression. "Perhaps I was wrong," she admitted. "The state agents might see what I see now." Before departing, she pressed a small pouch of coins into his hand. "For winter clothes," she said. "Those children need proper coats." As her wagon disappeared down the road, Jed realized they'd gained another ally, one whose support might prove crucial in the battles that lay ahead. The autumn fair transformed the small Wyoming town, filling the air with the scent of cinnamon and hay. Jedediah Boone stood awkwardly among the crowd, his weathered hat in hand, watching as Hannah organized her siblings with practiced authority. "Everyone remembers what they're doing?" she asked, straightening Mary's collar. The younger girl nodded, clutching her carefully wrapped needlework. Months of practice under Miss Abigail's patient guidance had transformed her clumsy stitches into delicate patterns worthy of display. "I'm going to eat more pies than anyone ever has," Samuel announced, bouncing on his toes. His enthusiasm drew chuckles from nearby townsfolk who had once whispered about those orphans, but now greeted them by name. Ephraim stood apart, nervously adjusting the rope in his hands. The calf roping competition loomed ahead, and he'd be facing Thomas Crow, Silas's 14-year-old son, who'd been handling cattle since he could walk. "You've got this," Jed said quietly, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Remember what we practiced." The day unfolded in a blur of activity. Rebecca trailed after Clara, who had surprised everyone by arriving with fresh-baked apple tarts for the baking competition. The once disapproving sister now moved with ease among her brothers. Unconventional family, occasionally catching Jed's eye with a small smile of acceptance. Mary's embroidered handkerchief earned second place, bringing a flush of pride to her cheeks as she accepted the red ribbon. Samuel, to everyone's astonishment, devoured 7 slices of pie before finally admitting defeat to the blacksmith's son. His face smeared with blueberry filling, he grinned triumphantly at the crowd's applause. The calf roping contest drew the largest audience. Sheriff Wallace served as judge, his stern face impartial as competitors lined up. Thomas Crow went first, executing a nearly flawless performance that brought appreciative murmurs from the crowd. When Ephraim's turn came, the boy's hands trembled visibly. Jed held his breath as the calf burst from the chute. For one terrible moment it seemed the animal would escape, but then Ephraim's rope sailed through the air with unexpected grace. The loop settled perfectly, and his small body braced against the pull with strength born from months of ranch work. The crowd erupted in cheers as Sheriff Wallace announced the time, 3 seconds faster than Thomas Crow. That evening, as lanterns illuminated the fairground, Jed watched his children move among the townsfolk with newfound confidence. Miss Abigail appeared at his side, her hand briefly touching his. "They belong here now," she said softly. Jed nodded, a tightness in his throat as Hannah led her siblings in a country dance, their laughter rising above the fiddle music. For the first time since they'd arrived at his gate, he saw them not as burdens, but as miracles. His family, forged in hardship but standing tall in the golden light of autumn. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the town square as Silas Crow arrived with 2 stern-faced state agents in tow. Their polished boots clicked against the wooden boardwalk, drawing the attention of shopkeepers and passers-by. Jedediah Boone stood rigid beside Miss Abigail Turner, his weathered hands clenched into fists as the 5 children huddled close to him. "By order of the Wyoming Territory," announced the taller agent, unfolding an official-looking document, "these orphaned minors are to be remanded to state custody for proper placement." Hannah stepped forward, her thin shoulders squared with determination. The eldest orphan's eyes flashed with the same fierce protectiveness that had kept her siblings alive through their hardships. From her pocket she withdrew a tattered piece of paper, their mother's letter, carefully removed from Mary's rag doll. "Before you take us," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent square, "you should know why we came to Mr. Boone's ranch." The girl began reading the letter aloud, her clear voice trembling slightly with emotion. "My dearest children, if you are reading this, I'm gone. Seek a man of honor, one who will keep you together as I no longer can. Trust in each other and in the goodness that still exists in this world." Mary clutched her repaired doll tightly while Samuel and Ephraim moved closer to their sister. Rebecca, the youngest, held onto Jed's pant leg, her small fingers white with tension. "All 5 of us belong together," Hannah continued after folding the letter. "And Mr. Boone has given us a home." He taught Ephraim to mend fences and Samuel to be careful with the cattle gate. Her voice grew stronger. "He braided Rebecca's hair when she cried for our mother and helped Mary fix her doll." Townspeople had gathered now, forming a protective semicircle around the makeshift family. Clara Boone, who had once advocated sending the children away, stepped beside her brother in silent support. "These children aren't just orphans to be shipped east," Miss Abigail called out, her normally gentle teacher's voice firm with conviction. "They're part of our community now." Sheriff Wallace removed his hat, studying the faces around him, neighbors he'd known for years, now standing united against the agent's paperwork. The lawman cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he suggested to the agents, "we could delay this matter until the circuit judge arrives next month. Allow time for proper consideration of their situation." Silas Crow's face darkened with frustration as the agents exchanged uncertain glances. The wealthy rancher's scheme was unraveling before the will of the community. As the agents reluctantly agreed to the delay, Jedediah placed his hand on Hannah's shoulder, a silent acknowledgment of her courage. The townspeople nodded in approval, and for the first time since the orphans had appeared at his gate, Jed felt the weight of isolation lift from his shoulders. The wind howled like a wounded beast as winter returned to Wyoming with unforgiving fury. Jedediah Boone stared out the frosted window of his ranch house, watching snow pile against the fence posts he and Ephraim had mended months earlier. The blizzard had raged for 2 days straight, trapping the family inside and cutting them off from town. "Will our cattle be all right?" Samuel asked, his small face pressed against the glass beside Jed. "They're sheltered in the south pasture," the rancher answered, ruffling the boy's hair. "We moved them just in time." A desperate pounding at the door startled everyone. Hannah rushed to open it, revealing one of Silas Crow's ranch hands, half frozen and frantic. "Mr. Crow's in trouble," the man gasped as Jed pulled him inside. "His men quit after an argument, left the north herd stranded in the open. They're dying in the snow." Jed's jaw tightened. His rivalry with Crow had defined much of the past year, the wealthy rancher's schemes nearly costing him the children. Yet the thought of cattle suffering needlessly twisted something in his gut. "I have to help," he announced, reaching for his heavy coat. "We're coming too," Hannah declared, already pulling on her boots. Ephraim nodded firmly beside her. "It's too dangerous," Jed protested, but the determination in their eyes mirrored his own stubborn resolve. "You taught us about responsibility," Ephraim said quietly, "even for folks we don't much like." Within the hour, they were fighting through knee-deep snow, Jed and Ephraim on horseback, Hannah riding behind her guardian. They'd left Mary, Rebecca, and Samuel in Miss Abigail's capable hands. The scene at Crow's north pasture was grim, cattle huddled together, some already motionless beneath white blankets of snow. Silas himself worked desperately alongside his remaining hands, his expensive coat caked with ice. He looked up in disbelief as Jed approached. "Boone? What in God's name?" "Save it," Jed cut him off. "Where do you need us?" For hours they worked side by side, driving cattle toward a sheltered ravine. Hannah proved remarkably skilled at calming frightened calves, while Ephraim's quick reflexes prevented several animals from bolting into deeper drifts. As dusk approached, Silas found himself working alongside Jed, both men exhausted beyond words. "Why?" Crow finally asked, his voice barely audible above the wind. "After everything." Jed glanced toward Hannah and Ephraim, who were helping a newborn calf find its mother. "Some things matter more than old grudges," he said simply. When they finally returned home, frostbitten and weary, Miss Abigail met them with hot coffee and blankets. The children's faces glowed with quiet pride despite their exhaustion. "Never thought I'd see the day," Clara murmured to her brother as the family huddled around the stove. "You and Crow working together." Jed merely nodded, watching the 5 children who had changed everything. Sometimes the fiercest storms brought the most unexpected changes. The price of heroism proved steep. Jedediah Boone surveyed the damage as dawn broke over the snow-covered plains. Nearly a third of his cattle lay frozen or scattered beyond recovery, a devastating blow to his already modest operation. His hands, cracked and raw from the rescue effort, trembled slightly as he counted the survivors. "We did what was right," Hannah said, appearing beside him at the corral fence. Her eyes, wise beyond her years, reflected the same exhaustion that plagued them all. "Silas would have lost everything." Jed nodded, placing a weathered hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes doing right costs more than doing nothing." Inside the ranch house, Mary huddled near the stove, her small fingers still blue-tinged from the cold. Rebecca sat beside her, both girls wrapped in quilts donated by neighbors who had arrived at first light. Samuel, despite his exhaustion, recounted their adventure to Sheriff Wallace, who had come bearing supplies from townspeople. "You should have seen Ephraim with that rope," the boy exclaimed. "Just like a real cowhand." The sheriff's usual stern expression had softened. "Word spread about what you all did. Folks are mighty impressed." By midday, wagons began arriving. Miss Abigail came with the schoolchildren, carrying baskets of bread and preserves. The blacksmith brought tools to repair storm damage. Even Clara appeared with 3 neighboring families, driving cattle, a gift to replace some of Jed's losses. "The community looks after its own," Clara said simply, Her earlier resistance to the children's presence completely vanished. Ephraim worked alongside the men, his pride evident as they treated him as an equal. When Silas Crow himself arrived, hat in hand, the boy stood tall beside Jed. "I've misjudged you, Boone," Silas admitted gruffly, "and these children. My offer stands, but differently now. A partnership between our ranches, not a taking." As twilight settled, the visitors departed. The family gathered around the hearth, exhausted but content. Jed looked at each face illuminated by firelight. Hannah's determined profile, Ephraim's newfound confidence, Samuel's curious eyes, Rebecca's gentle smile, and Mary clutching her precious doll. Miss Abigail remained too, her presence now familiar and essential. "We're family," Jed said suddenly, his voice thick. "Not by blood, but by choice. By standing together when it mattered most." The children moved closer, forming a circle of warmth against the howling wind outside. In that moment, Jed understood that the cattle lost were a small price for what they'd gained, a belonging deeper than possession, stronger than the bitter Wyoming winter, and more precious than any herd. The ranch breathed easier as the days after the blizzard passed. Morning sunlight streamed through frost-edged windows, illuminating the changed dynamics within Jedediah Boone's once solitary home. Clara moved about the kitchen with newfound purpose, her earlier resistance to the children's presence replaced by quiet determination as she helped restore order to their lives. "I never thought I'd see the day," Jed remarked to his sister as they watched Miss Abigail Turner teaching the younger children their letters by the hearth. "You staying on like this?" Clara's eyes softened. "Neither did I. But some burdens become blessings if you carry them long enough." She squeezed his arm before returning to her bread-making. Hannah, who had carried the weight of her siblings' welfare for so long, found herself in an unfamiliar position. For the first time since their parents' passing, she could relinquish some of her vigilance. The eldest orphan watched from the doorway as Abigail gently corrected Samuel's penmanship, her heart easing at the tenderness in the schoolteacher's manner. "You don't have to stand guard anymore," Jed said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Not all the time." The girl nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "It feels strange," she admitted. "Like putting down something heavy I've been carrying so long I forgot it was there." Later that evening, while the younger children slept, Ephraim sought out Jed in the barn. The boy who had once run away now approached with measured steps, his face solemn in the lantern light. "I thought I didn't need anybody," he confessed, helping the rancher repair a saddle without meeting his eyes. "Thought needing help made me weak." Jed continued his work, giving the 10-year-old space to find his words. "I was wrong," Ephraim finally said. "I can't do everything alone. And I want to learn from you. About the ranch. About being a man." The rancher placed a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's the bravest thing you've said yet." Outside, Abigail walked alone, beneath the vast Wyoming sky. Her decision to defend the makeshift family had cost her standing with some in town, yet watching her from the doorway, Jed saw only contentment in her expression. "Any regrets?" he asked when she approached. The schoolteacher shook her head, her smile genuine. "Not one. I've found my place, Jedediah. Right here." As they stood together in the crisp evening air, the ranch house glowed with warmth behind them. No longer just a shelter, but a home forged through choice and sacrifice. The family they had become wasn't bound by blood, but by something perhaps stronger, the deliberate decision, made anew each day, to belong to one another. The first snow of the new winter drifted lazily from the Wyoming sky, each flake catching the golden light of dawn. Jedediah Boone stood at his ranch gate, the same gate where, nearly a year before, 5 shivering children had appeared like ghosts in the night. Now they flanked him proudly, Hannah with her chin held high, Ephraim standing tall beside his mentor, Mary clutching her repaired ragdoll, Samuel bouncing on his toes, and little Rebecca holding tight to Jed's weathered hand. "Look at that sky," Abigail Turner whispered, her shoulder brushing against Jed's as she joined them. The schoolteacher's presence had become as natural as the changing seasons, her quiet strength the cornerstone of their unlikely family. The hardships of the past year had etched new lines around Jed's eyes, lines of worry during the flood, lines of determination during the confrontation with Silas Crow, lines of fear during the blizzard. But among them now were unmistakable lines of joy and laughter, deepening whenever Samuel told one of his impossible tales, or when Rebecca mastered a new skill. "The north pasture needs checking," Jed said, his voice carrying the same gruff tone as always, though the children now recognized the warmth beneath it. Ephraim nodded seriously. "I'll saddle the horses." The boy who had once run away in frustration now moved with purpose, his steps confident across the yard he had helped rebuild. Hannah watched her brother go, then turned to Jed. Clara's letter arrived. "She'll be here for Christmas." The eldest orphan no longer carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, having learned to share her burdens with the rancher and the teacher. That evening, as wind whistled through the eaves of the ranch house, the family gathered around the hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows across walls that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to family. Mary leaned against Jed's left arm, Samuel and Rebecca curled against his right, while Hannah and Ephraim sat cross-legged at his feet, all listening as Abigail read from a dog-eared book. When the story ended, the children's eyes grew heavy with sleep. As Jed carried Rebecca to bed, she wrapped her small arms around his neck and whispered, "We belong here." Later, standing in the doorway watching over 5 sleeping forms, Jed felt Abigail's hand slip into his. The words that had once terrified him, "All 5 of us belong to you now," echoed in his mind with new meaning. What had begun as burden had become blessing. What had started as duty had transformed into love. The family forged through choice, and trial would face whatever came next together, unbroken and unafraid.